Hello, and welcome to Rear View Mirror Chronicles, a podcast that takes serious history and makes it a little more fun. My name is Keith Hocton. I'm a public historian, author, and broadcaster, and I love most, if not all, things historical. And the show today is about kilts and tartans. And the reason for the show is because a wee while ago I did a podcast called A Story of Scotland, which generated a lot of interest, and the majority of the requests that have come through have asked about kilts and tartans. So I thought I'd run a quickie podcast and tell you as much as I could before going to the more serious subjects a little bit later on. And I might do a few of these because they're actually quite good fun. So first of all, kilts are supposed to be fun. They're a fun garment. And the first question that I always get asked is, do you wear anything under your kilt? In today's world, that's a dangerous question to ask. But bear with me and all will be revealed. Metaphorically speaking, of course. And the second question is, why is a kilt called a kilt? And the usual answer that I give is because the last person to call it a skirt got killed. Sorry, just a wee joke, folks, a wee Scottish joke. But I do remember going into a kilt maker's and getting fitted for a wedding and asking the kilt maker there, why is a kilt called a kilt? And that was the answer that I was given, and I've used it ever since. So the first recorded kilt in terms of the Scottish kilt was in the 16th century, and back then it was actually called a great kilt. This was a garment that actually wraps around the waist and was long enough that the top half could also be used as a coat. So you're looking at the very grand versions of the kilt, the big piece of material that comes up and over the shoulder. And a great example of that, if you want a visual example of that, was Liam Neeson in Rob Roy, where he wore a great kilt to trample around the Highlands. And if you haven't seen that movie, you should. It's very, very good. Interestingly, he also had an Irish accent. And what I loved about it was that he didn't try to disguise the fact, which you have to give him kudos for. Scottish accents are really hard to do. And if you were slightly off with a wee word or two, it's unlistenable. And of course, Scotland started with the Picts and the Gaels, the history of, and they most certainly came from Ireland. So you got to give Liam a pass. But while I'm on that subject, there are some noteworthy Scottish accents that have been done on film that have been terrible. Number one on the list is Mel Gibson in Braveheart, which was made, I think, in 1995. And while Gibson's portrayal of William Wallace in the movie was critically acclaimed, and I actually loved the movie, even though it was horribly historically inaccurate, Mel wasn't consistent with his Scottish accent, and he wasn't entirely accurate with it either. So for me, he gets a 7 out of 10. Then there was Keanu Reeves in The Devil's Advocate, which came out in 1997. And I liked the movie. And what I didn't like was Keanu's portrayal of a lawyer with a Scottish accent. The film was actually given mixed reviews. Like I said, I liked it. His accent was pretty average. I go to a 5 out of 10 for trying. Last but not least, there's Catherine Zeta-Jones in Entrapment. And while Catherine Zeta-Jones is Welsh and not Scottish, her attempt at a Scottish accent was pretty crap. So that's a 4 out of 10 for me. I could also mention Christopher Lambert in Highlander. That was an interestingly French-Scottish accent. There was Mike Myers in So I Married an Axe Murderer, one of my favorite films. It makes me want to laugh just even thinking about that film. And Sean Connery actually gets a mention in The Hunt for Red October. Sean Connery, as you know, is Scottish. And in The Hunt for Red October, he was playing a Russian. What was notable was that he kept on going back to his Scottish accent. As I said, the Scottish one is a hard one to do. Anywho, I digress. In the 18th century, the small kilt, better known as the modern kilt, became extremely popular throughout Great Britain. And that's basically just the bottom half of the great kilt, but way less material. And that's the kilt that you would actually usually see people wearing today. The word kilt throughout the course of history has been the subject of much debate, but kilt is actually an old Scots word which means to wrap clothes around the body, and it derives from the old Norse word from kilter, which means to wrap or to fold a skirt. So that's where that comes from. And kilt is likely to have evolved from a woolen cloak that the Scots called a bracht. And this, in the beginning, kind of way back, back 1,000 years, this would have been very plain, certainly for the Highlanders. But if the wearer was wealthy, it might have had a very early tartan-style design. But for the man in the Highlands, definitely not. It would have just been a dark material. During the course of the 16th century, these cloaks for the great kilt had grown to a length of around 7 yards long. So the whole kilt, completely unraveled, would run to just over 7 yards in length. And of course, it had to be secured by a belt, which led to the later development of belt hoops being incorporated into the kilts. But that wasn't until the 18th century. So nowadays, whenever you get a kilt, regardless of what type of kilt you end up with, a great kilt or the ordinary short kilt or a turn kilt, the smaller of the kilts, you're going to end up with belt loops around the waist to hold it up. The last thing you want to happen if you're wearing a kilt is for it to fall down. And that has happened before. Actual fact, oh no, that might be giving away a secret. I was going to tell you about a black watch incident that happened in Hong Kong at the turnover or the changeover from Hong Kong from British hands into Chinese hands in 1997 that I was witness to. But I will save that until the end of the show. So with great kilts, and the extra fabric, as I mentioned earlier, these could actually be brought up and over the shoulder, which was the way you would usually wear it. And then it could also be used as a hood during the inevitable Scottish downpours, or as a camping pillow, or as a blanket if you were forced to sleep out in the elements. And keep in mind that the Highlanders were herding sheep and herding cattle, or cattle rustling, so they were sleeping out in the elements a lot. So this great kilt was a really utilitarian, piece of equipment for them. So essentially, it could be pulled up over your head as a hood, keeping you or keeping your hair nice and dry, or keeping your face from the snow or from the rain. But also, if you ended up having to sleep out and you were in the woods and you came across a tree, you could actually just bunch it up into a ball and rest your head on it and fall asleep against the tree. So I regularly get asked about the point or the necessity of a kilt. It was like, what was the whole idea behind the kilts in the first place? Why were they invented? So I'll add a description here that I found from 1746, something that was written just before the Battle of Culloden. And it stated that men could make quick marches to bear out against inclement weather, to wade through rivers, and to take shelter in huts or woods and rocks without any encumbrance around their feet. So if you think about that, the lowlanders wouldn't be wearing kilts. So these would be people who lived in places like Edinburgh or Glasgow or Inverness, those type areas. They wouldn't be wearing kilts, but they would be wearing woolen trousers. And if you think of the heaviness of wool when it gets wet, especially if you're running through or walking through mud or puddles, any of the above, which you would have definitely had to have done in those days because there were no fixed pavements or roads. The bottom of your trousers, when they get wet, they get heavy. And when they get heavy, they start to pull down. The kilt, only being a knee-length garment and held at this time by any sort of belt that you could probably get, eradicated this problem, which meant that Highlanders could actually run through the Highlands, walk through the streams without any of that happening. So that was why the kilt was invented. However, contrary to popular belief, Scots didn't go into battle wearing their kilts, and they were generally removed before the battle took place. And the Highland charge was actually conducted only wearing a shirt that was either made from leather or linen or canvas that ran to about knee length. Obviously, your privates aren't on show for the whole world to see, but by removing your great kilt, it gave you freedom of movement. You could run faster, you could dodge quicker, you could duck and dive with ease. And it's interesting because when you watch movies like Braveheart or TV series like, Outlander, which I also love, by the way, these Highlanders are actually running into battle wearing their kilt. And obviously that's done because they're on TV. I'm sure they could have got away with it somehow had they decided to, to stick to what originally takes place, because it just would have been more interesting, I think, to add that detail into Scots going into battle, because we've all grown up with this misnomer, really, that Scots actually ran into battle wearing their kilts, but they absolutely didn't. And a secondary reason, and a very important reason, why you didn't wear your kilt on the battlefield, and if you use Culloden as an example, is that 2,000 Highlanders actually died during that battle. And what would happen at the end of the battle would be that the bodies would get looted immediately by the families who were following behind the army. And they took absolutely everything. And a kilt was actually a very valuable possession. So the kilts were removed before the battle and left with your family just in case. So the small kilt, or walking kilt, was invented around the 1720s, and this was actually due to the British government's exploitation of the Scottish Highlanders after the Jacobite Rebellion of 1715. The English actually forced the Highlanders to work making charcoal and smelting iron ore in very hot and very dirty places, and it was a very physical job. So the great kilts that the Highlanders were wearing at the time were found to be way too cumbersome and way too dangerous to perform these particular duties. So that kilt was actually tailored to contain only the lower half of the great kilt, which also came to be pre-pleated, which wasn't the case of the previous kilts. So when you look at a kilt on the backside, or the rear, from behind, the rear end of the kilt is actually pleated. It's got a really nice, intricate pleated pattern on the back, which doesn't continue all the way around to the front. And the reason that this small kilt was tailored in that way, which then became the standard for all future kilts, was because it gave you more cushioning and something more comfortable to sit on. So there's more material at the back of the kilt. Before this, with the great kilts, they would essentially just be folded and pressed. But keep in mind, 7 yards of material, so you didn't need the pleating at the back. You didn't need the extra padding at the back because you had 7 yards of material with which to play with. So after the events of 1745, the Jacobite uprising, and 1746, which was the Battle of Culloden, where the Jacobite army were defeated by the English under King George II, he then decided to introduce the Dress Act, also known as the Disclothing Act. It was part of the Act of Prescription, which made wearing Highland dress, which included the kilt, by all men and all boys illegal in Scotland, north of the Highland line, which ran from Perth to the east to Dumbarton in the west. And effectively, the intent of this was to completely suppress Highland culture and do away with the clans. So great kilts, shoulder belt swords, ski and doos were immediately banned. Sporrans, you couldn't wear them. And you couldn't go into, and back in those days, you couldn't actually go into the Highlands without seeing people wearing these items of clothing on a daily basis. Or just carrying a ski and do, for example. And a ski and do is a knife that would generally be kept in the sock. So you're wearing long socks, it would be slipped into the sock. And of course, if you're running around the Highlands, you don't want to be carrying a knife with you. So this was actually a really easy place to keep it. Of course, it was one of the items that was banned. Nowadays, you can't actually buy a real ski and do. Well, you probably could on eBay, but if you go to a proper kilt makers and you're having your kilts made with all the accoutrement that go with it, they won't sell you a proper ski and do because of the reputation that Scotland has with knife crime. So ski and do's nowadays, and they're actually an important part of the kilt dress, have to be made out of plastic. And it's been that way for about the past 15 or 20 years. I think when I got mine, definitely when I got mine made, I had a proper ski and do, and I still have it to this day. Though I'm not too sure, thinking about it now, whether it's actually legal to wear. So I'd have to check on that. So the Dress Act effectively banned all kilts. You couldn't wear a kilt, you couldn't wear a long or a short kilt anywhere in Scotland. You weren't allowed to speak Gaelic, and you couldn't hold clan meetings or play the bagpipes. This was against the law. And breaking that law of 1746, was severe. On the first offence, you would face 6 months imprisonment, And on your second offense, it was 7 years transportation. So basically 7 years sent out to the colonies. And of course, there was no guarantee that you would ever return. This act actually remained in place for 35 years. So 35 years of not being able to wear your kilt or being able to wear your Highland dress. The only exceptions that were made that allowed you to wear a kilt were if you were part of a British regiment from the Highlands, or if you were nobility, Scottish nobility, or if you were English nobility visiting Scotland, and they brazenly flouted this law when they came to Scotland, knowing the effect that it would have. So a regiment that was allowed to wear kilts were the Black Watch, which is a Scottish Highland military regiment of great renown. They were allowed to continue to wear their kilts, but of course keep in mind at this stage they didn't have their own tartan, and the Black Watch tartan has since become quite famous. Back then it would have been a generic dark cloth, because as I'm about to explain to you, tartans didn't really come into vogue until a lot later. As another example of this ban, people on the island of Seal, which is on the west coast of Scotland. It's a little island just off the west coast of Scotland, and you can actually throw a stone to it from the mainland, and it's actually quite beautiful. And if you want to visit it, it's spelled S-E-I-L. If you want to have a little look on Google, or if you're visiting Scotland, I would encourage you to go and have a look at it, because it does have a great history. It's a nice little spot to visit, especially if you're heading to the Auburn area. So the people on the island of Seal would continue to wear their kilts around the island. But if they had to visit the mainland for whatever reason to see a doctor, they would visit something called the Tinna True, or the House of Trousers, which is what that effectively translates to. And it's actually a pub facing the island of Seal. And what they would do is row or walk across the bridge and then go into the pub wearing their kilts, swap into a pair of trousers, and then go about their business. Then when they had finished whatever they were doing, they would walk back to the pub or head back to the pub, change back into their kilt, probably after a pint or two, and then row or walk back out to the island. Interestingly, that island is actually connected to the mainland by a wee bridge, which was built in 1793. And I have to say that the bridge is actually in pretty good condition considering how old it is. It's called the Clachlan Bridge, and it spans over part of the Atlantic Ocean, and it's referred to now as the bridge over the Atlantic. And as far as I know, it's the only bridge that actually crosses over the Atlantic Ocean. If it's not the only one, and I'm happy to be corrected, it was certainly the first bridge to be built across the Atlantic. 1793. That's an old bridge. In 1822, King George IV visited Scotland, and he loved a good kilt. And rumor has it, a man in a good kilt. Not that there's anything wrong with that. And he regularly wore his with bright pink hose or tights. And it was during this time that the popularity of the kilts came back into vogue across Britain as a whole. It was also at this time that tartans started to become identifiers of clans. Tartans became individual designs, designed specifically with a clan in mind. And that hadn't been the case before. So tartan, if you're not familiar with it, and there will be some of you out there that may not be, is a checkered pattern made usually from 2 or more colors, almost always in squares. And some tartans, depending on their complexity, can take up to 60 weavers to put together. In the US, tartan is actually referred to as plaid, where in Scotland it's just called plaid. And plaid is either a tartan cloth or a blanket, but not what you would actually refer to as a kilt. So you can wear a plaid or a plaid shirt because it's a shirt made from the cloth or the blanket, but kilts themselves are not referred to as plaid or plaid. And it was just before the middle of the 18th century that tartans changed from being regionally specific to clan specific. Previously the weavers would weave to their preferences, really whatever they wanted, and they would use what dyed wools were available at the time. A lot of the kilts, a lot of the original kilts would have been quite dark colors, colors that were actually easy to dye. The intricate reds and the yellows, the blues and the greens, well, they didn't arrive until a lot later when it was universally more affordable to be able to buy or dye wool in intricate colors. Back in the 16th and 17th century, that would have been a very expensive exercise. So from the middle of the 18th century onwards, many new patterns or tartans were created and then artificially connected to the clans. And this is something that's important to note. And of course, with the Victorians' love of taxology and the development of artificial dyes, it meant that new colorful designs could be created and applied to a full nostalgic view of Scottish history. Effectively, what the Victorians were doing was portraying Scotland as they wanted to portray Scotland. There are records of tartan patterns dating from about 8 BC, and one example was actually found on a 3,000-year-old man called the Chechen man, which is a mummy near Shanying in China. The first example of tartan to be found in Scotland dates back to around the 3rd century AD. And it was found near the Antonine Wall. The Antonine Wall was a wall that was actually built by the Romans 20 miles inland from Hadrian's Wall. And this particular piece of tartan was found at Falkirk and is now referred to as Falkirk tartan. Tartans these days are even linked to football teams. And there's some belief that you can only wear your family's tartan and that other tartans are completely off limits. For example, the royal family's tartan, which isn't the case, and it definitely shouldn't be the case. If you see a tartan and you like it, wear it. There is no law that says otherwise. And when you're questioned about it and someone says to you, and they always will, is that related to your family tartan? Don't be embarrassed to say that it's not. Tartans are a wonderful thing. Kilts are an amazingly fun thing to wear. So pick a tartan that you love and wear that tartan. Don't think that it has to be connected to a family. On a personal note, I love wearing a kilt, and I would regularly do so when I was living and working in Hong Kong. The Black Watch, a Scottish regiment that was founded in 1725, has a great modern association with Hong Kong. And although I love their dark green and blue tartan, and my mother is a Grant, I don't wear it. To create the watch, 3 companies were formed by members of Clan Campbell, captained by Campbell of Loughnell, Campbell of Carrick, and Campbell of Skipness. 1 clan of Fraser of Lovat, captained by Lord Lovat, and 1 of Clan Grant, captained by Colonel William Grant of Ballandolloch, and 1 of Clan Munro, captained by Munro of Culcairn. So although Grant and my mother comes from that clan, helped create the Black Watch, Grant actually has its own tartan, and I much prefer the reds and the greens of that tartan, and that's what I had my kilt designed, or that's how I had my kilt designed in the Grant tartan. I would also wear kilts for weddings or for formal occasions because they're such good fun, or when I attended a St. Andrew's official occasion or official function where you could get away with actually wearing a kilt with the sporran, with the socks and the black shoes. Of course, you'd have a ski and do in your sock, but you would actually wear it with a really casual shirt. You didn't have to wear the jacket. And you would wear it with a blue shirt would work well with the sleeves rolled up. And you looked quite smart. You looked comfortably sexy smart, if that makes sense. If you visit Scotland these days, you'll see a lot of the tour guides wearing kilts. And I think they should. I love it. As I said, they're fun pieces of kits to wear. And these days, they're actually called utility kilts because they have pockets sewn into them that are very handy if you're carrying a lot of stuff around, things that you have to carry these days, like, your wallet and your phone, etc. And these pockets are deep and they're waterproof. And they have to be because of the amount of rain that Scotland receives. But I just love the way that they've been adapted into modern wear. So one last thing to talk about in terms of which is integral to kilt wearing is a sporran. You can't wear a kilt without a sporran. You just can't. You look naked without one. So a sporran is an important bag which is chained to you from around the waist. And commonly now, it's actually you get a combination of chain and a leather combo that feeds through the belt loops on your kilt, and it's placed in front of you exactly in the position of where your where your nuts and bolts are, effectively protecting one of the more important areas on a man. And of course, there are different types of sporrans too, ranging in size and ornamentation. My mind just went somewhere else. For every occasion. There are day sporrans, which are small and lightweight, with little to no ornamentation whatsoever, no tassels, nothing like that. And of course, then there's the full mask sporrans, which are made of horsehair or badger hair, with extreme decoration and ornamentation, with up to at least 12 tassels hanging down from them. Sporrans were originally made so that you could keep your daily porridge ration in them. And if you're in the early army regiments, going back to the 1800s, any food that you could fit into your sporran was important because you ate on the run, you ate on the march. And they would usually be made from leather, so completely waterproof, and decorated on the outside with either horsehair or badger hair, as I mentioned, which would keep them completely waterproof. Nowadays, they wouldn't be made with that. They would probably be made from synthetic materials, and they look just as good as the originals, I have to say. And let's face it, we want the animals to be kept safe and well, which is pretty important in this day and age. So I have no objection to what they're doing. And as I said, the synthetic sporrans now look as good or better than the real ones. The full kit garb also includes the jacket, called a Prince Charlie jacket after Bonnie Prince Charlie. It has a long tail at the back and is usually quite a short suited jacket at the front. And of course, it's finished off with a nice shirt and a bow tie. A tie that actually just finishes off the look. It's one of those details that actually makes or breaks it. And of course, a real bow tie should be worn, not the clip-on type, guys. Learn how to do a bow tie. It's a must. Some of the kits that you'll see out there have matching ties, so you'll actually see ties that match the kilt, but it's not necessary. And I tend to go with a silk bow tie, primarily because I just don't like tartan ties. And also because tartan ties are actually made from wool and they can be a little bit scratchy. I have to admit, I'm not a big fan of the tartan tie. And of course, to finish the kilt off, you'll need a nice wide black belt, which is usually a very ornamented belt, and it has an ornamented belt buckle. And then of course, you've got your sporran, which we mentioned above. Another important thing that I nearly missed out is, of course, your kilt pin. And I have one. I have an antique one that is a broadsword, probably running to about 4 inches long, with a beautiful amber head at the top of the scabbard. And this pin is important. Mine's probably about 150 or 160 years old. That's not why it's important. It's important because it holds the front of the kilt closed. Kilts, even the short kilts of today, are still long pieces of material that wrap around in layers. And the kilt pin is what stops it from blowing and opening up the front, revealing the last secrets of Scotland. They're very important. And decoratively, they're actually very important too. And they really set the look of the kilt off quite nicely. So what does a man wear under his kilt? Well, under the kilt, you've got your socks or your hose, your kilt hose, and you must wear flashes with these. So flashes are essentially little pieces of fabric that you put at the top of your sock, and then you tuck the fold of the sock over the flash so that there's a tiny bit of fabric that actually just runs down the outside of your calf. And it's little details like this that really kind of set the outfit off. And last but not least, there are the shoes, the dreaded kilt shoes. There is nothing worse in this entire world than wearing a pair of kilt shoes. They are the most annoying pair of shoes that you will ever wear in your life. And I'm not a big fan of formal shoes as it is, but these are formal shoes that have no tongue on them. So you can't get a snug fit around your foot, especially around the top of your foot. And because you're wearing woolen socks, you're constantly sliding in and out of them. Added to the fact that they've then got laces that come from the shoe up and around your shins, up and around your calves that tie just below the knee. Tie it too tight and you'll end up losing pretty much all feeling in your feet. Tie it too loose and the whole thing just flops around and you have to tie your shoe 1,000,000 times a night. Ladies, you have no idea of the effort that all this involves. Oh, hang on. Actually, maybe you do. I retract that last statement. What's funny, though, is that at a Scottish wedding, you'll always find a group of men helping each other tie each other's shoelaces. It's funny to watch. It's completely impractical. And I'm sure that the Highlanders never wore them that way. It's just a fancified thing. I tell you what, though, whoever came up with that design should be shot. Last but not least, and what everyone wants to know, do Scottish men wear anything under their kilt? Two stories for you. When I was in Hong Kong and I was there for the changeover of 1997, the Black Watch came out and they used to come out every morning and they would march out from their barracks, usually 3 men, and they would carry the Union Jack with them. They would get to the cenotaph and they would raise, first thing in the morning, they would raise the flag and then they would do exactly the same in the evening and take the flag down. And when the changeover took place in 1997, it was a major event because of the evening of the changeover, they were lowering the Union Jack over Hong Kong for the last time. And for those of you who were there, or even those of you who weren't there, we had the worst weather of the entire year building into this incredible storm that would take place that night. So during the day, it was incredibly windy. And of course, the 3 lads marched out to the cenotaph. There was a massive crowd there to see the last lowering of the Union Jack. And it was as windy as hell. And kilt pins or no, and you can probably Google this, there is a fantastic photograph of these 3 lads lowering the Union Jack, and the wind whips up their kilts, and what you get is 3 bared bums. It couldn't have been staged better. It was fantastic. So that probably gives you a very good idea of what men wear under their kilts. Also, there was I've got a history with the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, which was another Scottish regiment that were actually disbanded, or they were amalgamated in 2006. And I had cousins and uncles who both served in that regiment. And one of my cousins, Dennis, was a sergeant major. And of course, one of his jobs was to inspect the men as they came out, on parade. And he said that one of the things that he used to do, and of course he picked up that habit from other sergeant majors, was that they would walk along with a mirror on a long stick. And every now and again, they would pop it under the soldier on parade just to see what he was wearing. And God forbid if you were wearing underwear. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this chat, ladies and gentlemen. As I said, it's a quickie that I just thought I'd throw out there because there were so many questions about kilts after that episode on Scotland. I hope you enjoyed it. It's been a lot of fun. Please rate the show on whatever platform that you listen to it on. If you give it a 5-star rating, I'll be extremely happy, which will push it up the charts. Thanks again, folks, and I will speak to you soon. Bye for now.